Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to this podcast discussion, which is being organised by EBSWA, the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance. The discussion we're having tonight is about the likely and the possible impact of the UK Supreme Court judgment on children's services in the UK broadly. So my name's Maggie Mellon. I'm a social worker and one of the founder members of EBSWA, Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance. You can find us and a record of our work on our website, which is predictably ebswa.org. And you can also find a record of my writing on maggiemellon.com. So we've got two speakers tonight. We've got Stephanie Davies Arai, who has a background in teacher training and in parent advocacy, and is the author of the book Communicating with Kids. But Stephanie is also the founder and director of Transgender Trend, which was the first UK organisation which called for or advocated for evidence-based care for children questioning their gender. So obviously, the evidence base is important to both of us, to the EBSWA and to the Transgender Trend, and they also advocated for science-based education. So Stephanie was awarded the British Empire Medal for her in the late Queen's Jubilee birthday honours list. And our next speaker after Stephanie will be Robin Carling, who is a UK-based social worker who's spent the last 9 years working with children and families. Robin's got his own Substack where he writes on the topic of gender identity and social work practice, as well as developing training on the subject for social workers. We had hoped to have Sarah Phillimore, a family court barrister, who's written and engaged with this issue extensively and is quite well known for it. But holidays and other commitments meant we've had to separate the two discussions. So we've actually got a second podcast planned on this issue, which will be done shortly next week sometime. We hope to have it out. So on to our discussion. What we've planned is that both of our speakers will give us about 10 minutes each on the subject, the topic. What is the impact? What will be the likely impact? What is the impact of the Supreme Court ruling about sex and the meaning of sex in the Equality Act? What is the implications of that for children's services? So both of our speakers are going to have up about 10 minutes each to talk about, and then we'll just have discussion where I might lob in some questions, or the conversation might just take off. They might just get going on their own. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. It won't take more than an hour, so we can guarantee you that we will close in time. And let's just see how the discussion goes on. So first of all, I'll hand over to Stephanie for her introduction.
Hi, Maggie. So the impact of the Supreme Court judgment, it does impact schools. Schools should have been impacted by the publication of the CAS review final report last year, but it seems that a lot of schools are holding on to the training that they've received from activist organisations, and they're still doing mixed sex toilets, changing rooms, sports, etc. One of the ways that the activist groups got this into schools was by saying that these policies, which were based on gender identity in place of sex, were in line with the Equality Act. And so I think actually anybody who's involved with the care of children, safeguarding should be the first consideration. And I'd like to see that emphasised a lot more from the Department for Education. Schools have been trained, or they have been given guidance on the Equality Act, but of course they're not experts in equality law. So it's very easy to frighten teachers, social workers, anyone who works with children, with the threat that if they don't impose this policy, they'll be going against the Equality Act. So that's the situation in a lot of schools, and we hear from parents who've got children in these schools about policies where boys are allowed into girls' toilets, their changing rooms and their sports. And now with this judgment, it's really clear. Sex means sex. It doesn't mean gender identity. So any policy that you've got based on separate sex facilities must be based on biological sex and not how a child feels. So that is a real clarification for schools. They shouldn't need it because they should have been doing that anyway, because separate sex toilets and changing rooms are a statutory requirement in schools, which schools seem to have forgotten about. But that's really clear. So schools can just now make their policies separate sex, and boys are not allowed into girls' facilities, girls are not allowed into boys' facilities, and that means no male pupil in female facilities or no female pupil in boys' toilets and changing rooms. It does not mean there are no exceptions to that. No male student can be allowed into girls' facilities, no matter what other protected characteristic he may have, no matter what his identity is. It's just a blanket policy, and that's the only way that single-sex facilities can work if it's a blanket policy for everyone. So that's really clear, and that should, schools should immediately, because the Supreme Court didn't change the law, it clarified the law, and that law has been in place since 2010 when the Equality Act came in. It's good for teachers, and because the teachers who were worried about this but felt they couldn't say anything, now they can point to the Supreme Court ruling and say, well, this is the law and we must follow the law. And it's very simple. We've always needed that. Very clear, and should have come from statutory guidance from the Department for Education in the case of schools. But now it is really clear. And so schools have no excuse to continue breaking the law. I think the other thing that's really important here, though, is apart from the safeguarding aspect in terms of shared, mixed-sex facilities, is social transition. And I think that policies on that were also justified by Stonewall in terms of being in line with inclusion policies within the Equality Act. And that was never true. The Equality Act never mandated treatment of children. Again, the Cass Review final report should have put an end to social transition of children in schools. But what the Supreme Court ruling does is it makes it really clear that if you call a boy a girl or call a girl a boy, that interferes with that child's Equality Act rights and the Equality Act rights of every other child in the school, because you are putting, say, a boy into the girls' category. It's the wrong category to put them in for their legal protections. And so it's a legal reason. It's a strong legal reason, quite apart from how it ever benefited children from being socially transitioned. What schools have to consider, the Cass Review is clear that it was 4.9% of children who were being referred to the Tavistock were children in care. And so children in care are overrepresented in schools. Schools also have to consider the children whose parents transition, and particularly girls who have fathers who transition. And often there's abusive relationships going on there from the father towards the daughter, and the father is trying to be a woman and getting the daughter to collude in that. And so policies in schools of social transition and the real celebration of trans and the encouragement of children to be trans allies, there's never any thought about the children who may be suffering real confusion and distress at home with a transitioning parent. There are also going to be a proportion of children in schools who've been sexually abused as children, and that won't necessarily be shared by them, but there will be a proportion of those children. And so those children are particularly, put in the position of, say a girl having to accept a boy into a toilet or changing room, may be very traumatizing for those children. So they're all different groups of children who require special thought and consideration. But the trans policies that have been infiltrating schools and social work over the last decade have not considered the special needs of certain groups of children. It's been a sort of blanket policy where boys must be affirmed and validated as girls, and girls must be affirmed as boys. So we shouldn't need the Supreme Court's judgment, but it really does, once and for all, make it very clear that policies in schools and with children need to be based on biological sex and not gender identity. So I'm hoping that the Department for Education will be quick now in publishing the gender questioning guidance for schools and make that really clear. And I do think that it is now impossible not just to have shared facilities, but to socially transition children in schools. And that was a huge safeguarding risk and should never have happened anyway. But I think it will, and it's taken something as important as the Supreme Court judgment to make that really clear that schools have to follow that law, what is the law and always has been the law. And hopefully it will raise awareness more in schools that safeguarding has to be the first concern when you're in the care of children.
Right.
I would just add actually another thing that I think is really important, which is the reaction to the Supreme Court judgment from trans activist groups and various people. We've seen protests, we've seen openly displayed misogyny and threats against women. We've had various organisations coming out saying that they are going to be inclusive and they're going to ignore the law. Children are aware, particularly adolescents, are aware of the wider culture and the wider messages on social media, on mainstream media. And so there's going to be, the children who identify as transgender are going to need very careful and compassionate treatment because they're being encouraged to believe that this judgment will destroy them, take away all their rights, make it impossible for them to live in society. And the girls who perhaps didn't like and resented the policies of boys coming into their toilets and changing rooms may not dare say anything, may not dare express their relief that now it's clear that toilets and changing rooms are separate sex. There may be bullying from some children who have been encouraged to be trans allies and see this judgment as anti-trans and bigoted. So schools need to be aware of this, that children are aware of the messages in wider society, and that is likely to be the situation in schools. It's likely to be that way round, particularly if a school has celebrated trans and encouraged children to be trans allies. So the girls who welcome the Supreme Court judgment may not feel comfortable in saying so. They may feel they have to go along with the crowd and object to the Supreme Court judgment, or they may get bullied if they express that they agree with it. So teachers need to be aware, and teachers' role has always been to be role models for children, and so their reaction to it, they need to do a lot more in explaining the law to children in a calm way, and that includes teaching girls that they do have rights under the Equality Act, rights to equal opportunity and equal rights. And so which girls have not been educated in their own rights in this respect, or Equality Act rights, and that schools also need to do more to teach children why those rights are important and why it's important that we have separate sex facilities for men and women, boys and girls, and the need of girls in particular, both sexes, for privacy, dignity, comfort, but girls in particular for safety. Schools need to do more work to educate children in these areas.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much, Stephanie. So yeah, we've got a kind of statement about what should be happening, and also a kind of clear recognition that the job's not done and there's a lot of work to do. So I'm just going to move straight on to Robin. I think there's a lot in that for discussion, and hopefully Robin will be able to talk, raise some of the similar issues in social work. So on you go, Robin.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie, and thank you, Stephanie. I one of your points that you made right at the end there, I think, is really crucial across both professions, which is that the reaction of the adults is going to inform the children of how they should respond, or to some degree, and it's going to influence them. And that's something that we've known as professionals for a very long time, that in teaching children to regulate their responses and adapt to the world around them, adults have to model those behaviors. And I think it's really key, because there's been a mixed reaction from my observation within the social work profession. A lot of people are confused or unsure about the exact repercussions of the ruling, but some of them have seen their role as to reassure the children who consider this an attack on transgender people, as it's been portrayed by the sort of activist organizations. And I obviously have a concern that if we adopt that position, we are reinforcing a cognitive distortion in these young people. You know, it's a sort of inverse of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's taking someone's distorted concerns about the world and exaggerating them rather than trying to balance them. But there's a big crossover in general for the consequences of this ruling for social work and teaching, in that obviously the provision of single-sex services, single-sex spaces, that's going to be across the board. So not just for social workers, but for the social care industry. It's going to include places like refuge, it's going to include carers, it's going to include all sorts of services and provisions that may have been argued previously to be implemented on the lines of gender identity rather than sex. And this ruling makes it very clear that not only shouldn't be happening, but actually that should never have been happening in the first place. But one of the less clear on the face of it repercussions, I think, is the implication for social transition, because there is now an obligation for organizations to acknowledge, recognize, and document biological sex. Obviously, that obligation already existed, but in many institutions that was being replaced by gender identity or obfuscated in some situations. And I mean, that should have been addressed following the Cass review. It should have been addressed following the Sullivan review. But the Supreme Court now makes it very clear that this is not a piece of evidence that, you know, the trickle down of evidence into practice can be very slow. This is a legal statute that we must adhere to. So there is no waiting and excuse for not acknowledging it. It must be acted on. So one of the consequences that has for practice is in consideration of what the role is of a social worker working with a young person. And to some degree, there is an overlap of that with teachers, and there is an overlap with parents, in that your role is helping young people to develop in a healthy way that prepares them for adulthood and independence, and protecting them from harm. So when you have a landscape where it's not possible for young people to biologically change their sex. It never has been. It is now not legally possible for them to change their sex. Their sex must be acknowledged as it is biologically. Then the arguments for social transition, as weak as they already were, become significantly weakened, because if you are effectively endorsing the word's gone from my mind, a fiction, that's the word that I'm going for. If you're effectively endorsing a fiction by telling this young person they are of the opposite sex, and that is going to increase the probability that they're experiencing distress or conflict with the world as they develop and have to experience more of it, then actually you're not safeguarding that child, you're not preparing them for life, and you are putting them at risk. You also have to think about the safeguarding situations that young people might find themselves in. If a male who identifies as a woman and happens to dress in a manner that might be considered womanly is posing a safeguarding risk to a young person, we need that young person to be able to refer to that person as a man, and to be able to raise those concerns without feeling like, oh, it might be impolite or frowned upon or get me in trouble to refer to this person as I'm perceiving them. And when it comes to sexual risk, that is always going to come at an increased rate from biological men than it does from biological women. That's a well-established risk factor. So I think that really the consequences of this ruling for practice are emphasizing things that should already have been in place from the evidence that has been there, in sort of pushing us to take a more neutral and wider view approach to this, rather than adopting the approach that's been pushed through ideologically captured organizations like Stonewall and Mermaids, and to some degree the local authorities and the governing bodies of social work themselves, who have been promoting the idea of gender identity and it taking precedence over sex for some time. Now, I think there is still plenty of room for philosophical debate to occur in terms of when people argue that gender identity and sex are distinct from one another, and what they use gender identity to refer to the social construct and sex. That and I'm not taking a position on that at this point in time. I'm just saying that there's still plenty of room for that debate to occur. But what we can't have now is this obfuscation that's occurred as a result of that debate, where people have gone, oh, gender identity is a social construct, but actually that social construct takes precedent over sex and is now obfuscating sex, and we conflate the two words. And so there has to be a clarity around that, and that you cannot use a self-declared identity to take precedence over biological reality.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. So I think both of you have set out the terrain, both in education and in social work or social care more broadly, where we know that there's the law is quite clear. It's quite clear what should be happening, but there's some reluctance maybe to accept it, and also some difficulties with how the law is being responded to. And both of you have raised concerns about children and how the impact on children, and whether there's been a huge mess. How is it going to be cleared up? Stephanie?
Yeah, I think Robin made really good points about preparing children for life, because it's, not everybody is going to agree with gender identity. Not everybody is going to accept that a boy is a girl, or a girl is a boy. It's just, human beings, it's a primitive brain function. We can pretty much discern what sex people are instinctively. And so, that was the situation anyway. But now there are even fewer reasons to justify transitioning to school. I think what's happened over the past decade is that medical transition has increased. So the availability of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones have been increased with the Tavistock's early intervention study of puberty blockers, which was 2011. Suddenly, children could access medication at earlier ages from the start of puberty, and legal transitions. So since the Gender Recognition Act, adults can get their birth certificates changed. And so the legal rights, the legal transition and the medical transition have sort of gone hand in hand. And so children over the past decade have thought, right, they can go on to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then they can get legal sort of sex change. And now, I mean, they can still get a gender recognition certificate, but it doesn't make any difference to using the opposite sex facilities. They can't do that. So, and in terms of medical transition, well, puberty blockers are no longer routinely available. The Secretary of State's now looking at cross-sex hormones. They're going to be not available so much. We don't know exactly, but from clinicians are going to really have to justify it if they want to give cross-sex hormones to anyone under the age of 18. They've got to exercise extreme caution. So both those things are going downhill, which is why the trans activists are saying we're losing trans rights in this country. We're going backwards. But actually, those rights should never have been there. They were never rights to use the opposite sex facilities. And in terms of medical transition, well, we all know that was based on what Cass has described as inadequate evidence. It has been a medical and a social experiment on children. So it's not that children are losing rights. All we're doing is actually bringing medical clinical treatment to the same level as normal standards of paediatric care. Children have never had the right to change legal sex and get a gender recognition certificate anyway, but that was coming up in the future, and that would give them, they thought, access to opposite sex facilities. So it's been really cruel, I think, to have given children this idea that they really have changed sex if they have an identity of the opposite sex. It's taken children away from the grounding in reality that they need just to be healthy, mentally healthy human beings. Children are quite capable of understanding that you can't change sex. We need to be much more honest about children. In schools, for example, I think you can easily say the school policies have to be based on biological sex for safeguarding reasons, for protection of children. But we accept that teenagers are exploring identities. It's their job during the teenage years, and we welcome children exploring all identities as they grow up. And children together can ask their friends to use their preferred pronouns and do all that within their friendship groups. It's just that the adults shouldn't be joining in, because adults in position of authority, whether social workers or teachers, should not be lying to children, because you haven't changed sex and it's just not true. And so to give children that false impression is, I think, not preparing them for real life, where they cannot, in reality, live completely as the opposite sex, and nor can they expect everybody to agree with them and affirm them as the opposite sex. So that situation has never been, this really, the whole gender affirmation approach has been in order really to support an ideology. It's not to support the children. I think children have been cruelly used in order to advance an ideology and a global movement. And so I think that get back to reality, and children can accept it. Children can accept rules, and I think children need those rules and boundaries in order to feel secure. And so when the adults start sort of shifting about and even denying the reality of something so fundamental as your sex, which is just a human biological reality, I think that makes children very insecure, really, and is not helpful for children's mental health or feelings of being safe. I also think it takes away, I think, Robin, you touched on this, the language to report abuse. Children need to have confidence in using words that have clear meanings. And so if you make a child feel, I can't say man in this case, I have to say, this again is a real safeguarding concern. And I think that confusion about who is a man and who is a woman is putting children in a position of risk outside the situation that a social worker is working in or a teacher is working in, outside the school setting, outside care settings, in the real world. So if a man, even online, is saying, that I'm a woman, and then the girl's been taught all her life that she must respect that and respect that he's a woman, or in real life in changing rooms and toilets, that she must be kind first and foremost. And actually we're taking away girls' ability to use their instincts and they know really, and those instincts are really important for self-protection. That a girl would not treat an adult male in the same way as she would treat an adult female. The boundaries are much.
Robin, you were talking really there earlier in your bit about the sort of how adults react to what adults say to children and how important, what the importance of that. Or were you wanting to come in on something else there?
Sorry. I think that it's a crossover between just responding to what you said there, Stephanie, is that we are effectively teaching children at that point in time to deny what they are seeing and experiencing and to report something that they believe to be false, because children have the capacity, as you highlighted, to distinguish between male and female. And we're actually saying to them, deny what you're seeing and experiencing and report what you believe to be false on the basis of protecting the feelings of this other person. And that's a very dangerous precedent to set with children, because we need children to be able to speak up honestly and raise concerns they're feeling without concern for how that might impact the other person, because sometimes the other person might be an abuser. And I'm not saying that's necessary. I'm not saying that's specific to the case of gender, but they need to be able to talk up in the case of anyone who might be an abuser without concern for their feelings. And that's already plenty complicated enough when it comes to children who are reporting concerns for their own parents, because they have mixed emotions on that and things like that. So we need to remove the barriers. And that has been something that we've spent the entirety of human existence trying to figure out how we remove the barriers to children addressing abusive behaviors. But the other theme that I really picked out in what you were saying is informed consent. When we're talking about should children be having puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones and things like that, one of the issues with that is that the children can't possibly understand the consequences of that. But when we talk about social transition, the same thing applies. Now, Cass has made it very clear that should be considered an active clinical intervention for good reason. And we need to know if those young people are going to be able to understand that. And there are some areas that, like you said, are natural for young people to explore. Maybe they change their hair color, they start to, wear black makeup and dress like a goth, or in my case, get a big blue Mohican and start to wear patches and all of that sort of stuff. But, experimenting with the way you present yourself in the world is quite normal. We've added this extra layer to it that has a more fixed nature, that's almost like you're making a permanent decision. If you change your name or your pronouns, that's a lot harder to come back from, because you've created this social pressure from those around you, because you've sort of made a big deal about making everyone else change it. For a young person to go, oh, actually, I've changed my mind, is something that's quite difficult from that point. And we have to think about what are the situations where that this young person might experience. You know, that it might be fine in their peer group who are all also adopting alternate gender identities, or who are very accommodating and supportive of this. But what happens when they hit 18 and they go out to a bar and you know, they are a male pretending to be a female, and they find themselves surrounded by a load of men who aren't so tolerant of that, who aren't as understanding of it, or they find themselves in some sort of situation that they haven't thought through. And this is why it's should be considered a clinical intervention, because that young person needs to know, well, how does that work when you're at a family reunion? How does that work in this situation? And we can't have that level of conversation with them in schools. We can't have that level. It would take a very long time with clinical oversight to explore all those eventualities and make sure that the young person is in a position to consent to that. So there's two sort of angles there of denying reality. One, teaching young people to deny reality makes it harder for them to report concerns. And one, denying reality doesn't prepare them for the realities that they might face and denies them the opportunity to give informed consent to anything that is happening.
Yeah, it's like you said, on this one thing, we've taught children that they have a gender identity and that's sort of innate and can't be changed. And so I think we've talked a lot about the experiment of medical transition, so-called transition, because it's not really. But I think social transition in the school setting is a social experiment. Again, we don't have the evidence to show that it's beneficial or that it creates risks. But what we do know is that children who are socially transitioned are more likely to go on to seek medical intervention. That's a risk too far, in my book. You know, if you're, and it's obviously going to happen. You're going to cement an identity, and what you're doing is you're denying the child that open future that they should be able to have. And I agree, children can't consent. They have no idea. It's not the case that it's benign because it's not medical. It's psychological. So, of course, it's very, very powerful, particularly if you're getting adults in positions of authority also affirming that you're the opposite sex. So I think, you know, when it comes to things like the Equality Act, equality in human rights law, I think it's a really blunt tool to look at how we treat children. And I think part of the problem is that the Equality Act has been brought into care of children, because when that happens, and it's why I think Stonewall et al. Have used it, but what happens is that you've got protected characteristics such as sexual orientation and gender reassignment, and all of the protected characteristics have no age limit. They're all adults and children together. And once you start looking at children in terms of protected characteristics, you lump them together with adults and you fail to distinguish between adults and children. And that's why I think we've seen, as schools have become more aware of Equality Act obligations and duties, you've seen more of children being adultified and treated the same as adults. And in the case of gender reassignment, that has been particularly harmful, but we should never have called children transgender in the first place. But, you know, the protected characteristics exist. And so we treat children the same as we treat adults according to the Equality Act. But where I think, you know, children's rights do come into it is that some of children's rights are sort of held in abeyance, like they have a right to fertility, for example. They have a right to full sexual function as adults. They have a right to equality in terms of making long-term relationships. And those are rights that children sort of, they don't have when they're children. They don't have the right to full sexual pleasure. Children. But they have, that's a right that comes in the future. And so we have to protect those rights that children will grow up to have. And we're denying them those rights if we set them on this pathway that takes them towards sterilisation and lack of sexual function, and which impacts their ability to find a long-term partner, whether they want children or not, or whether, those are decisions that children can't make. And it doesn't matter how mature they are. I hear this so much, but, a mature child can make. No, it's the life stage. It's the life stage. It's childhood. And that's childhood is defined as anybody under the age of 18. And, so children are not capable, and we need to, to distinguish childhood from adulthood and go back to treating children as children, which is far more compassionate and far more kind than treating them as mini adults.
Yeah, that's an area that we've been discussing quite a lot in EBSWA, just about this issue of childhood, the state of childhood capacity, and all that. And that's very helpful. And we've also talked about this adultification of children. So Robin, what's your sort of response to that? Or do you want to take it further?
Well, I think, sorry, I just knocked the microphone, so that might have made some unpleasant noises. I apologize. I think that there is a lot of ways in which the Equality Act is generally abused and leveraged by organisations who have their own ideological agenda. For example, when reading the Supreme Court ruling, it was making very clear that the protected characteristic of gender reassignment still exists. And that was actually part of the grounds for why they made the ruling that they did, because you wouldn't have the two distinct categories if you didn't intend sex to refer to biological sex. There's a number of other factors, but that was just one of them. But what these organizations tend to do is they tend to leverage people's legal ignorance against them, because while the Equality Act will protect both adults and children exactly the same under the category of gender reassignment, for example, if a young person, so the criteria is anyone who's proposing to undergo, has undergone, or is undergoing treatment, which is a very, very vague criteria, because proposing to undergo could be as simple as a young boy saying, "Daddy, I'm a girl." That could be sufficient or arguable to get the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. But what the Equality Act actually protects in that situation is that young person shouldn't be discriminated against purely based on the fact that they've said that thing, which is something that people on all sides of the argument would agree with. We're not going to say that because a boy has said he wants to be a girl, he can't play on the boys' football team anymore. We are going to say he can't play on the girls' football team because he says he wants to be a girl, because that would be violating the protected characteristic of sex, because the girls' team is protected in that regard. But what these organizations tend to say is, well, actually, it creates a positive duty on you to respond to them in this certain way. If you're not affirming them, then you're in breach of the Equality Act. And I'm sure that the future contains many debates with these organizations trying to argue that gender reassignment means that you have to affirm people, but that's not what it means. And in that regard, the legal ignorance of the general public, which is unavoidable because I think that we're quite a minority, those of us who are willing to trawl through legislation and consider its implications. I'm aware of my idiosyncrasies, but it's being leveraged, and we need to find protections against that. And that's one of the reasons that we should be incredibly grateful for this Supreme Court ruling, because it does make it very clear, and it removes some of that room for maneuver to exploit legal ignorance.
I suppose just remembering that one of the questions that certainly Stephanie had thought would be good to address would be how did we get here? How did social work become, and social care and education become so captured so easily and quickly without what seemed to us very obvious issues of childhood safeguarding, all of the issues that both of you have addressed, and the sort of huge risk to children of inviting them to live in an alternate world, and which the adults seem to have actually been, some of the adults been living in. So I don't know if you want to sort of look at that in the closing, or not the closing, but in the last sort of quarter of an hour we have, or at least some of that.
Yeah, so I think the same thing has happened with schools and the kind of guidance going into schools. And we can be, there's a sort of wholesale capture going on here, which I think has been created through a sort of, fear and, but, there were various other reasons. But in the case of social work, it sort of, I think, began properly around in 2013. There was an agency called Three Circles Fostering, and they began the LGBT Youth in Care project. It's now known as the LGBTQ plus Youth in Care, and I don't know what a Q plus child is. But that's a network of LGBTQ plus care leaders, local authorities, care organisations, residential care providers, etc. And that was followed in 2014 by Speak Out, which was a national study run by the University of East Anglia. And that looked at LGBTQ young people's children's experiences of the care system. And that ran between 2014 and 2017. But I think it was as with schools, it was the government's trans equality inquiry, the Women Equality Select Committee inquiry in 2015, when things really, really kicked off. And the government's response to it, because the government's initial response to it was they sort of didn't give them all the demands they made, which really came from trans activist organisations, but they promised to look at them. And so in 2016, the Department for Education commissioned a study on the adequacy and consistency of child and family social worker education in regard to gender identity and gender variance. And the GEO, the Government Equalities Office, funded an evidence review. And that was done by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And that was looking at inequality among the LGBT people. And that included LGBT families, adoption and fostering, one of its areas of concern. And then Trans Youth in Care was published by Three Circles Fostering. It's a toolkit for social care professionals. And that was made together with the LGBT Foundation, Mermaid, Sparkle, Trans Equality Legal Initiative, and basically it's an activist manifesto. So all the usual groups together there. And in 2018, the Department for Education published Transgender Awareness in Child and Family Social Work Education. And that was a research report. And Mermaids and Gyres were interviewed for that study. And, if you look back, that was in 2018, and some of the quotes from that report, you can see that it's totally ideological activist language. Trans is an umbrella term used to describe people whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. And worryingly, the term transgender, therefore, covers a wide spectrum of gender nonconformity and gender variance, which is worrying how gender nonconforming children have been pulled into this. And so then CAFCAS, which is, the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service, they published new guidance in 2023, and it was based on the LGBTQ plus Trans Youth in Care Guide. And that really is a checklist for trans activists. It's like a trans activist manifesto. disregards the findings of CAS, and by that time the interim report had been published. And they present medical transition as normal and unproblematic. And they say, this is a couple of quotes from this guidance: any suggestion that some children state they're transgender for attention because they've been influenced by social media or others, such as parents, is wrong. And also, children are not immune to being exposed to high-profile gender-critical views, and the fact they are children does not protect them from its everyday impact or inhibit those making such assertions. So there's really clear a sort of guidance there that if you question this and speak against it, then you are one of those evil gender-critical people. And so, and then we've had cases of social workers such as Rachel Mead, and that's really exposed the total capture of the social work profession into, having believed the narrative that's been spun to them by trans activist organisations. It's incredible to me that, right from the start, so you've got the government in there, you've got trans activist organisations being given free rein to talk about children, which is children's education and children's health, which is not an area that they're qualified to talk about. These are adult social justice activist groups and causes. They're not about children. They're certainly, they're not about individual children and vulnerable children. So it's gone in so deep that it's going to take time to turn around that narrative that you're necessarily working against children. The words that I see come up a lot are children's autonomy and agency. And I'm afraid I'm suspicious when I hear those words now. They never mean something good. They mean, I think they're words that are quite flattering for adolescents to think they've got agency and autonomy. But I think they're being used to, as we talked about, adultify children and treat them as adults.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think there's a few more key things that have happened along that progression as well, because in 2021, Social Work England announced its partnership with Stonewall, and in the same year, the British Association of Social Workers released their first sort of statement on working with transgender people. And in both cases, there was a heavy focus on the sort of gender ideology, trans activist narrative. And I think really as a profession, social work, because it places a heavy emphasis on things like social justice, anti-oppressive practice, and all these more ideological, philosophical positions that are exploited by these organizations to sort of argue their case. We were speaking earlier about you said, Stephanie, in terms of rights and sort of saying all of this is a right. That's a social justice argument that is made, and because the social work profession leans towards those narratives anyway, they're very susceptible to anything that's marketed under that guise. And so unfortunately, when the bodies have captured this, and when you've then been, a lot of the main providers for training were Stonewall, were Mermaids, were Gaia's, there was only a small number of organizations that were offering training that were sort of considered leaders and experts in this field, although I'm sure if you scratch beneath the surface, there isn't much to justify their position. But that's how they were perceived. And so you had a field where there was a sort of ideological lean anyway, and then you had these supposedly reputable organizations coming in, giving a narrative that appeals to that ideological lean and saying, actually, this is the only way to practice ethically. And it managed to bypass, unfortunately, what should be a far more robust system of critical thought and requests for evidence, where we should be taking a step back and saying, actually, this is quite a big divergence from our usual practice, and where are the pitfalls here? But unfortunately, as a profession, we seem to have been fairly primed to accept that. And social work isn't particularly unique in that, because that has happened across society to some degree. Many institutions have been captured by these ideas, and it feels like we're sort of waking up, in the process of waking up from quite an unpleasant collective dream in some regards. But yeah, it's just been a continuous trajectory of increased influence coming from both the bottom up, in terms of sort of activist organizations and pressure group, and the top down in terms of the governing bodies and regulators and institutions promoting and endorsing these ideas. And it's made it very, very difficult. Even beyond the big cases of Rachel Mead and Lizzie Pitts, and the ones that have sort of got some media attention, there are many other people, as we know, and people who we do know, who have experienced some very negative reactions to raising concerns about this. Trying to raise what should be considered typical safeguarding concerns has brought people under extreme scrutiny from their employers, from the public, from colleagues. It's made it a very difficult environment for people to navigate and try and bring evidence and critical thought to the table.
Yeah, I've been very aware of that. With when Stephanie was talking, just thinking there's a whole generation of social workers being sort of duffed up over this. For every Rachel Mead, there's like 1,000 others saying, "Oh God, oh is this, that must be wrong," and with all the associations. So it is. There's a lot of mess to clear up. Sorry, Stephanie, you were
in the training now of training of psychologists, training of social workers, training of teachers. Or, when you get young people coming in who have been totally indoctrinated into this, and we'll have the school leavers who've had it all reinforced in schools that this is fact. It's not. But even the child sexual abuse inquiry that published something that we just came straight from Stonewall, and SPCC totally captured, also related to Stonewall. And it's just, there are so many red flags. I find it really concerning that those who are, work in child safeguarding haven't seen these massive red flags and thought through actually what are the consequences in terms of child safeguarding of introducing this ideology into work with children. And to me, they're really obvious.
Yes, I mean, they're so obvious that, and as you and Robin were talking, just about what is the impact on a child of telling them, "Oh no, that man's a lady," and be nice. And I mean, all of these things are like classic child protection scenarios that you just go, "No, this child's been lied and doesn't have any defences against that," and then the adults are all conniving with it. It's like a classic sort of horror movie or whatever. So,
yeah, because it's gaslighting, isn't it?
yes.
You're really
Also, it's like children. It puts all children in such a vulnerable position where adults are, actually conspiring to deny reality and to tell them that they must do that. So it does seem, it seems almost. I mean, there are other places or other things in social work I could point to, satanic abuse and stuff, but I've not seen anything where people have so massively gone down a rabbit hole, and nobody. And there has been a duffing up of anybody that wanted to stop it. So, I mean, it does, well, without being...
Which is a safeguarding concern in itself. If you're not allowed to talk about something that has a huge and very serious impact on children, then children are put at risk. I've never known an area in all my work where something has been introduced, it's some new sort of parenting idea or approach or something new in schools that hasn't been quite hotly debated. Is this going to be beneficial or not? Or, can we really apply this to children? How will they react to it? You know, those sort of questions are asked, and there's been such a total silencing in this area that in itself is a real safeguarding red flag.
So yeah, we're sort of approaching the 1 hour commitment to finish. In fact, we're just about there. So I mean, I think all this, what we've seen is this is a huge topic. It's something that we're going to have to be talking about and sort of clearing up and trying to help fix for a long time. And the Supreme Court wasn't the end of the battle, but just probably a stage in trying to right things. So I'd just like to say thanks to both of you for your contributions. Are great. I think we should have more of these discussions, and maybe try a webinar or something just to and invite some more participation in it. So EBSWA has got a few. They're on our website. We did do webinars during the lockdown. So anyway, thank you very much, and thank you for anybody who's listening. We hope you've appreciated this, and we'll be posting this up and hopefully posting more up in future. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Maggie.